Hi, welcome to those of you that are joining us. We'll take a few minutes here to let people filter in, and then we'll get started here shortly. Welcome to everybody who's joining us here for Secure from the Start with Christina Cacioppo. Give everybody about 2 minutes here to filter in, and then we'll get started. For those asking in the chat, we're listening to some Pure Calm. What a great playlist. We'll get started here in the next minute or so as we let just a few more people trickle in. All right, we'll get started here. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling or in from or joining us from today. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. Really excited about the jam session that we have for you today with Christina and Chris. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions for Christina or Chris, they'll have a Q&A at the end. If you'd please use the Q&A box here on Zoom. That's where we'll be looking for questions, and we'll leave the chat for general conversation and comments. Also, we'll continue the conversation as Zoom disappears at the end of the hour over in This Week in Startup Slack, and I'll drop a link right here. If you go to thisweekinstartups.com/Slack, you can join the Twist channel. We'll be having the conversation in the SOC 2 compliance channel. And again, I'll drop that in the Slack as well. A recording of the jam session will be sent out at the conclusion here today. And of course, if you're looking for more information on Vanta, you can find it at vanta.com. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christina Cacioppo, CEO and co-founder of Vanta. Thanks so much, Christina, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here today and talk to y'all with Chris. So as Charlie mentioned, topic today, secure from the start. We're going to go through some strategies to help startups and possibly your startup get secure, stay compliant, and focus on growth the whole while, since so much of startups is in fact growth itself. So that's our agenda. I'd like to introduce myself just briefly as well, and then pass it to Chris so he can introduce himself. So like Charlie mentioned, Christina founded Vanta about 4 years ago. We were initially focused on SOC 2 compliance, and we're broadening into security and other standards. And I'll pass the mic over to Chris to talk about himself.
Hey, thank you. Yes, so I'm Chris. I'm one of the co-founders at Incident.io. We are building a kind of incident tooling that fits right into Slack and works for an entire organization. So yeah, been going for most of this year. Have customers, looking for more customers. We'd love to talk to people, but yeah, good to be here.
Thank you. Great. And so just wanted to give a quick overview of things we'll cover in this session, and then of course we'll dive into each of these over the next 45 minutes or so. So to start, we'll start with kind of the basics and the foundation, and instilling a culture of security in your startup early on that doesn't slow you down. And often there's this perceived dichotomy between security and growth, or security and moving quickly, doing the right thing and moving fast. So talk to Chris about how he's balanced some of that at instant.io. Then once we kind of have an understanding there, move into some important things to secure and automate. And, great, you want to focus on security. What does that quite mean? So we'll dive in and get a little bit more detailed there. And then we'll talk about security certification. It's this alphabet soup of things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, really high level what they mean, and when you might want to pursue one of those at your startup. And then finally, if you have one, how you might use that certification to grow your business, open up new markets, move up market into the enterprise, and ultimately win more deals. So that is our agenda overview, and diving in on kind of 5 rules of thumb, and we'll return to these throughout this session. But as you think about security at your startup, these 5 things to keep in mind. First, starting early, even if you don't do things perfectly. Perfect really is the enemy of kind of the good, or getting something accomplished here. So again, we'll talk through that balance. Second, codifying as much as you can, often literally in code. Third, tracking people and things, how you can do that with, again, not putting sand in the wheels of your startup, not slowing things down, but still thinking through some of this tracking early. Fourth, centralizing and assigning. And fifth, how you demonstrate all this with a SOC 2. So those are, again, our 5 guiding principles, and we'll come back to them throughout the next 30, 40 minutes. So first, principle 1, start doing things early, even if you don't do them perfectly. So this sounds, probably high level, and probably curious what this actually means. And so, Chris, I'd be curious, what was the catalyst for you all to start thinking about security? You mentioned you're about a year in. That's probably pretty early in the life of your company. Like, why think about security?
Good question. So I guess just to elaborate, we are a kind of a B2B SaaS, and we are there to help companies when things go wrong. So company has something go wrong, they declare an incident, we are there to sort of help them through that. And sort of as part of that, that means that we are kind of privy to some pretty sensitive information. So, the inner workings of organizations and how and when they're not working. And so I think from day one, we were very aware that we were going to be handling, incredibly sensitive data that needed to be very, very secure. And I think then separately, like along with that, because we are kind of critical to companies when things do go wrong, and helping them get back on track, there's also like an availability aspect there. And I think security and availability are sort of very deeply intertwined. And so I guess like I'm one of 3 co-founders at Incident.io. All 3 of us have engineering backgrounds. And we've sort of all most recently come from a bank called Monzo here in the UK, which is sort of, growing 5 million customers. And so we're all kind of acutely aware of, what it means to run, systems with very good security, and certainly in like regulated environments where, you have to dot every single I, cross every single T. So kind of with that in mind, when we started the company, we sort of started on the right track. I think all of us were just like, it's sort of like non-negotiable security. And so I guess like we started the company, did everything very well. And for us, like when we started selling to customers, the vast majority of the customers that we were dealing with initially were sort of, your small customers. And for them, documentation that we put together around security and things like that were sort of totally appropriate for us to get through the door. And if it wasn't that, vendor questionnaires and that kind of thing. And I guess as sort of time has developed and we've started talking to bigger companies, it's become sort of necessary for us to have greater levels of assurance over that security. And so that's sort of like the journey that we've been on here, I guess. And so that's kind of catalyzed this push for us into SOC 2.
And to kind of just play back to you, make sure I understand, but a little bit of prior experience working in banking, so much more regulated, working with regulators, and kind of early importance there, combined with a little bit of the data you all store as an incident response tool, and how crucial that is to businesses. And so maybe these 2 things, prior experience plus, what your startup does, what your business does, combined to sort of elevate the priority of security higher than it may have been otherwise. Is that a reasonable playback?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I think there's maybe like a third thing, which is just that, as I said, like security is kind of just non-negotiable these days. And I think, like, unlike the past where sort of technology could end up being like a cost center for a business, like businesses are just founded on good technology, and technology, you know, when you start selling it, it relies on trust, and trust comes from handling everyone's data correctly. And I think a lot of all these things sort of like are very closely intertwined, and often the way you evidence that is through robust compliance, basically. And so it's sort of this cycle, I guess, this flywheel of the more security you do, the more customers you get, and then the more, you know, you need to be able to validate that sort of compliance.
Got it. Yeah. This third piece of more security, more customer demand, needing to demonstrate or show that security.
Yeah, for sure.
Neat. And so you've talked about focusing on security early. Our slide says start doing things early. What sort of things did you all do to get started?
I mean that's like $1 million question. Like, it's such a broad thing. I mean, like, purely like nuts and bolts things. Like, we started off thinking about like auditability and evidencing, and also just, you know, having robust processes for everything that we're doing. You know, so you can look at that from, you know, at the one end, like, we start with an idea or nothing, and we need to develop an app, right? And so the things that we sort of prioritize early on are build very good rails that allow us to kind of ship things to production safely. And a sort of a byproduct of having those rails is that you then can robustly evidence those things. And like, I think when we started, like, I've spent a lot of time sort of, for good or bad, at Monzo in like audits and assurance kind of activities. And I think I've sort of been burned by not doing a lot of this stuff up front. And so when we started, we would just, you know, while SOC 2 wasn't like an active consideration, like, I knew that auditing and being able to, like, in an externally sort of validated way, demonstrate that we were thinking about security, I knew that would be a thing that was coming. So yeah, everything from that. And I think a lot of what we'll dig into today, we can sort of like go into further on other things that we did along the way.
Okay, great. I'll hold off on asking you for more details right now, but as we go through slides, would love them. Okay, so that was covering principle one, around, you know, doing things early, even if it's not perfect. Moving to principle 2, so codifying as much as you can, literally in code. And so, Chris, kind of what sorts of things did you codify? Like, what, you know, I know you did follow this principle. What did it kind of look like at Incident?
Yeah, so I think, like, as I mentioned, like, early days, like, the priority for us was just to ship stuff as fast as possible. So like, optimize around like efficient delivery. Like, early days, we were shipping like dozens of times to production, like, you know, often breaking things along the way, which is fine because we're sort of in this cycle pre-customers and pre-having a product, and you know, it's a lot of fun in those stages. But equally, like, I think in those early days, we did compromise on a bunch of things. Like, there are things that are necessary when you are selling a product that are not necessary when you're sort of building a product like validation of anything. So a good example of that is like infrastructure. So whilst it sort of pained me somewhat coming from a background where like everything is infra as code, like, we clicked a lot of things into existence. So, you know, it's really, really quick to jump into, you know, your Heroku consoles and your Google consoles and go, I want a queue and I want a app to do this, and I want to put my data in this thing. And so we brought all those in. And I think that's like a perfectly pragmatic approach starting a company, or you know, early days of a company. Like, it does not make sense, and it's quite a big investment to go through and codify like everything. And so there is a line, there is a threshold. But we're now sort of, you know, several months in of, you know, being a product that people are using. And for us now, it is like the point at which we press pause on like rapid delivery, and we backfill a lot of these kind of processes and these things. So, you know, infrastructure is now managed by code, and we have good pipelines and rails for getting it out. And the sort of the plan from here on in is basically, if it sort of moves, and it can be, you know, defined in code or managed via an API, that's the preference for us. And I think we have the sort of the slight luxury of time to be able to do that now. And I think like when you look at the benefits of this, like this kind of twofold. There's like the operational benefits to like me as an engineer not having to worry about how I make a change to this thing, but having it in code and being able to go and do those things directly. That's fantastic. But I think there's these sort of secondary effects where, because everything's in code, it's incredibly easy to evidence when you do get, or if you do go down a route of needing to go down like compliance certification for whatever reason. So, being able to say, it's not just that we ask people to follow a process to ship things to production. We have this like enforced like golden path that means that every single piece of code that gets changed in production goes through a GitHub pull request. And as part of that, we run tests on it. And as part of that, we then deploy it automatically and we ask for review. And when you can do that, not just with your code, but with your infrastructure and then with the applications that you use, I think it just saves so much time on every single sort of downstream action like these audits and that sort of thing.
I was smiling when you were talking about clicking buttons, because that was also the early Vanta experience when we were building Vanta, right? Initially, it was a lot of console clicking and then moving things into an infrastructure as code tool, Terraform, and learning how it worked. And there was some slowdown there. And then once you have it, it being so much easier and, to your point, so much more auditable. And I don't just mean that in the compliance sense, but in the just engineer wants to know what happened, can actually just look through, code changes and pull requests and see what happened. So a similar experience for us too.
Nice.
Neat. And then now that you have some of this documented or some of these processes in place, and you mentioned 3 co-founders, I imagine you're also adding employees. And how do you teach new folks what you're doing, and how kind of the incident.io way of doing things is?
Yeah, so we are sort of actively, about to onboard our first employees, which is very exciting.
Congrats.
So yeah, a little bit early days to sort of talk at any great or sort of authority here. However, we have, like, as part of our like Vanta sort of process of going through that, we've been working on a lot of like the policies that we want to kind of enshrine at incident.io. And then when it comes to policies, I think there's a few ways that like writing and using policies goes wrong in companies. So I think like bad outcomes are that we write policies with sort of like no consideration of how things are going to be followed, or that we write policies to sort of pass an audit. And then, your employees join the company and you give them like, here's 15 policies to go read. And they're sort of like, well, I don't even understand the language in these things. It's really confusing and we're a startup and like a lot of these things don't apply. And so I guess as founders of a company, like our goal is to, capture the ways that we think things need to be done, the sort of adhere to, whatever it is that we're trying to certify against and the kind of ideals that we're holding for the company. But to do so in a way that is kind of like minimally compliant, like pragmatic and written in such a way that it's sort of like there to be consumed by people. So like I want people to be able to join the company. I don't think anyone's going to ever admit to enjoying reading policies, right? That's just never, that's not an ideal I think we'll be able to reach. However, what I think people should be able to do is to pick up a policy and sort of see their role reflected in that policy and go, I can see what this means to me. And so that's sort of like your sort of like A grade, and then your A star grade for this kind of thing is then taking your policy and again encoding it in such a way that someone doesn't have to actually remember to follow the policy, but the sort of like their daily job, they're enforced to follow it. So a good example is like we have a change management policy and we have procedures there, and you don't need to know you don't need to read the procedures and then use that as a sort of reference to follow it. You kind of can't do anything but follow that approach. So you have to raise a pull request. You don't have direct access into production. You have to go down those paths, and therefore policies become sort of like day one, this is my reference point, so I understand what's going on. And then maybe like day N, refer back to them so you sort of understand the context, or if you're, changing something or want to know more.
That sounds great, of having these policies be, initial explainers and, here's a relatively plain English guide to what's going on, but then also sounds like the way you set up your version control tool, GitHub, Bitbucket, whatever, is basically so the new engineer is on rails, as you put it. So everything they're doing is adheres to the policy the way you all as founders want to see it done, and done in the most secure way that's appropriate for your stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great. And thank you that was a great example too of writing these policies and then change management and some of the controls you've put in your version control tool as well. Neat. Okay, so that was principle 2, codifying as much as you can in code. Moving on to principle 3, track people just as well as you track things. Okay, so this one again is with the HR logo, right? Looking at employees. And so Chris, as you're bringing on your first employees, and again, congratulations, how have you thought about maybe more broadly, not just policies, but kind of employee security, right? People that have access to production data or customer data. How are you thinking through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like people is always where things get really hard. Like it's really hard to like code people to do things a certain way. I guess like from a cultural point of view, like as I said, security is like non-negotiable, and that's something we want to like embed very early on. We want everyone to really appreciate that, and that's not to say that it sort of trumps everything, but I think it's fine to sort of like actively deprioritize a security thing or to defer it to a later date, but it should never be an afterthought. So that's sort of like, I guess, like table stakes is people should appreciate that when they join. And I think to be completely honest, I don't know exactly how that's all going to fit together. Like that's our problem to solve, and we're working through onboarding things at the moment. I think like more kind of concrete things. I think there are things you can do to make it easy for people to do the right thing. And so when we look at you're setting up a new system, and like if there is an option to back it with Google Auth, so we use Google for everything at Incident.io. If there's a way to back it with Google Auth and 2FA, enable those features, and then no one has to make a choice, and you've sort of got this like base level of you are kind of good, in many regards. I think other things that like we want to kind of focus on is like not making people's lives hard. And I know that sounds a bit waffly, but I think there is a lot of times where security sort of gets in the way of people. It's a little bit like a human factors problem, and you sort of like design everything to sort of be compliant and sort of forget that at the end of that there is a human that has to get something done. And I think when you make things too difficult, people just find workarounds, and that's often working around security rather than working with it. And so I think keeping our practices in such a way that security fits in and doesn't feel like this awful like friction in everything that we do. Again, apologies, it sounds a little waffly, but I think there are lots of things we can do in there that will kind of make that the case. And I think even just embedding something which is like, if a security practice is making your life difficult or is introducing unnecessary friction, like whistle blow, basically let everyone know, and we figure out a different way. Don't work around it. So those are kind of useful things. And like fundamentally, I think just bringing policies closer to where people to where people are working, so that everything is sort of like fitting together nicely. Like some things are going to be really hard. I know that as we grow. Like I don't think I've been in a single company where like user access reviews have been easy.
To break in for a moment, what are user access reviews for folks who don't know?
Okay, yeah, great question. So this is kind of person joins your company, they are in Team X, and as part of being in Team X, they are onboarded and get a bunch of access to a bunch of systems that are necessary for them to be able to do their job. They then later might move somewhere else in the company, they might leave, they might, all of these kinds of things. And as part of that, their access to various systems is going to, necessarily change. And so user access reviews are like a process of checking that everyone in your company has the correct permissions and the correct access. And it's sort of like a necessary control to make sure you haven't got people who have got admin when they shouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, no worries. Thanks for querying it. I think there are like some of the solutions here are things like principle 2 of codifying things. I think it's a lot easier to review people's access if it relies on you reviewing a repo, or even having some automated thing in there which can sort of reconcile where people are, what access they have against roles that are sort of kept in some external system. So that's something we're working on at the moment. And then robust like JML, so joiners, movers, and leavers processes. So when people do change role, join the company, leave the company, you have even if it's like a manual checklist at first, which is probably where we will start in the interest of like pragmatism, onboard them to these things, check access in these things that are not codified, and everything else should just sort of take care of itself. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, I think that's largely it. I think like the main thing that I think will be a challenge for us in like the people side is like maturing processes in a sort of proportional way as we grow the company. So I think things that work for us now as a company of 5 people are going to start falling apart when we get to 15 people, and then 50, and then however big it gets. And I think sort of catching up on those inflection points and making sure that you have the right sort of controls as you grow is hard, but something that we're sort of acutely aware of and thinking about.
Makes a ton of sense. What I was going to add was this is how so Vanta, not the software, but the company, we started with access reviews and as checklists, and by that I literally mean a spreadsheet that had an employee's name at the top and a list of services down the first column, and then you would just put an X or put a date right in the employee cell where you're like, oh, I've onboarded, I've offboarded this. And in a lot of ways it wasn't very savvy, but sort of got us through the early days. And for us, I mean, a little bit of a special case, because then we started building some software within Vanta and within the product we build for some of this, and continue to work on this to this day. But it sort of came out to your point of these user access reviews being really important, being something that I think it's just hard for an organization to get right, because the spreadsheets fall out of date. There's as you grow, there's a lot of people joining and moving teams and that sort of thing, and so it also really helps to kind of make this someone's responsibility. And I'm jumping forward a little bit, but sort of assign a directly responsible individual or DRI or whatever the lingo at your company is, and just someone who knows it's their responsibility, versus more of a distributed thing, which kind of works in the early days, but just gets harder as the company grows.
Yeah, I think as well, like as you say, like early days doing it like brute force way and doing it in ways that sort of won't scale is a really great way of understanding how to sort of make it robust and scalable. Like when you do it firsthand, that's the best way you're going to be like, this is how we fix it long term.
Absolutely. Yeah, for us it was like the list of all the services down the first column is actually just really hard to keep up to date, and that's actually harder to keep up to date than the employee name piece. So what do you do for that? How can you discover what services people are using in a scalable or non-scalable way? But just learnings like that, to your point.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Wonderful. Okay, so that was principle 3, tracking people as things. On to principle 4, which is centralize and assign ownership, and this is where I scoop the lead a little bit. But again, maybe I'll just start this one more open. Chris, again, high level words on this slide. What does this mean to you? How do y'all do this?
I think this is like, for me, like one of the superpowers of like modern tech companies. I think I guess full disclosure, I wrote a chapter in an O'Reilly book recently called the Power of Uniformity, which is sort of neatly fits into this principle, but did not know about it before coming and agreeing to talk on this. So it's a lovely little marriage of minds there. But yes, I think fragmentation is kind of the enemy of like productivity of many technology organizations. Like the broader your technology stack and the more things you've got going on, and the more people doing all these kind of different activities across an organization, it becomes really hard to do everything, frankly. Like it's hard to make changes, it's hard to collectively like level up your org if you want to introduce some new kind of process. It's harder to assert that everything is following a certain practice, for example. So a kind of classic example here is you've got a company that's using like 10 different programming languages, and they're in a microservice world, and they've got 100 microservices, and that every single one of those is deployed how the team chose to do it. And like securing that is a nightmare, like near on impossible to have a watertight, like security kind of posture there. And the same for like making changes. It becomes really, really difficult. So you kind of, the goal, I guess, is to like minimize the surface area of your organization. So, you know, the fewer things you've got going on and the more consistency and uniformity you've got across that, the easier it is to say, do you know what, we want to enforce X. We want to enforce like, you know, vulnerability scanning on all of the libraries that our codes pull in. And if everything does everything the same way, that's one change and everyone benefits and everyone levels up across the entire organization. And like Monzo, I think Monzo is like, for me, the best example I've seen of this, and like obviously carry a huge bias there. However, they run something like 2,000 microservices, and every single one of those services is written in Go. Every single one of them is built from the same kind of framework. Every single one of them logs in the same way, emits metrics in the same way, and is deployed into production the same way. And like by virtue of doing that, the company is able to move super fast. And when we want to make a change to our security posture, or, you know, someone wants to audit something, it's like everything just gets like incrementally easier. So yeah, I guess around this kind of like principle, I think like, if I've interpreted it as I think you've intended it, like definitely very much down with it.
Yeah, great. Well, you literally wrote the book on this. What advice, let's pretend I'm not, you know, Christina from Vanta in 2021, but I don't know, Christina from Vanta in you know, early 2018. So just a handful of hooks, very early days. And I come to you wrote the book on this. What should I be doing?
I think the enemy of this kind of principle is organizations who are like overly trying to like appease people and like let people go their own ways and find their own ways, and that sort of, you know, slightly more casual attitude there. I think essentially it's like, don't be afraid to say no to people. So, you know, when someone comes along and says, you know, I want to use this new thing because it's going to make us way, way better. And like, there's probably a really robust case behind that, you know, proposal going forwards. But I think it is often like windowed on either some sort of like short-term outcome or a specific subset of the organization being able to move fast. And I think often folks miss the kind of the wider implications of these things. So like, yeah, the enemy of uniformity is like just the chaos that ensues. And I think the other thing is like just choosing battle tested technology. Often people say like choose boring technology. I don't think it is necessarily boring technology. Like I don't think Go is a boring technology. I think it's a pretty cutting edge technology, but it's battle tested. Like there are a lot of people and systems running on that. And like the same with basically everything that we use. I think that's sort of a couple of principles that are really useful to lean on.
Makes sense. I imagine having been party to or witness to some of these conversations, any advice, you know, again, on, to your point, some folks will come with very good intentions and say, hey, I'd really like to use, I don't know, Rust, because it'll, you know, make everything 90 quadrillion times better. Like, won't you let me use this shiny thing? Any advice to handle those conversations?
I mean, like personally, what's worked for me is, I think when you say no and people are like, but like this is going to make this thing faster, and it like objectively will. I think the best advice that I could give is like explaining local versus like global optimization. So it will almost, you know, there's usually a very good case where a team could choose a thing or deploy in a different way, and it will make their lives easier. You know, we saw this at Monzo, right? We run Cassandra as our sole data storage layer. And a bunch of people were like, if I could just use Postgres, it would make me faster at doing this one thing. And it's like, yes, but here are all the benefits to Monzo, the organization, if we all do things the same way. And I think like the things people often forget about is like, cool, well, your team goes and uses Rust when everyone else is using Go, and you smash your project out the park, and you know, it's fantastic, and everyone high fives and it's all great. And then the people in that team move to another team or leave the company, or, you know, whatever reason that thing is sort of no longer supported. And then the organization is the thing that bears the burden there. So they're the ones that are left holding this system. And, you know, you multiply that by a few times, and suddenly you've got these systems that, like, I've been in companies where that's the case, and you have disparate technology all over the place. Like no one knows what's going on. And I think that's ultimately what people have to be a little bit aware of. And I think when you've been through some of that sort of cycle a few times, you have an appreciation that like sometimes it's a bit unfortunate and a bit sad, but like you have to keep Rust to your sort of like your hobby coding, and you do that outside of work, and like for the good of the organization, you kind of suck it up and deal with what's on the plate basically.
The concept of global versus local optimization and maximization, I love that. I'll use that in the future. Thank you. Great. Okay, so that was principle 4, straight from the book. Moving on to principle 5. So thinking about demonstrating your security with a SOC 2, some sort of compliance standard, something from this alphabet soup here. Chris, I know you all are pursuing a SOC 2, and again, as 3 founders, so relatively early in your company's life. How'd you make that decision?
I mean, it was largely like pull of customers. So like I'll confess, like about 3 months ago, before talking to Vanta, like I really didn't know what SOC 2. I mean, I knew what it was from the side of like being someone procuring software or like buying a service or whatever it was. And like, honestly, sometimes it would be like checkbox, like we just need a SOC 2 because that's what supplier operations at whatever company it is I'm working at needs to sort of see. But for us, it was largely like, as I said earlier, like we started engaging a bunch of, bigger companies for whom, your security questionnaire or documentation that we provided sort of wasn't enough of a sort of a standard to hold up to sort of show that we were doing things right. And I think SOC 2 is that for many people. It is essentially a rubber stamp that says someone has done the due diligence on this company and, understands and has put the work in to make sure that they are thinking about data right and thinking about security practices right and availability and all of those sorts of things. So I think that was like the reason that we ended up deciding to do it, is just this kind of like external signaling that we can basically say Incident.io like deeply cares about security and have invested a lot of time in it. But that's not to say that we don't also value the process of SOC 2. Like I think it is always useful if you find a good auditor. It is always useful to have an auditor like challenge your practices and challenge what you're doing. It's really easy to just miss obvious things, and I think that's sort of part of the value here. So someone comes in and they can spot something that you might not, and that's ultimately good for your customers. So yeah, I think it's a sort of a no-brainer for us at the moment. And yeah, it's sort of excited to get the process sort of finished and rolled on.
Neat. So playing back to you a little bit, it sounds like there's some amount of the process itself, and finding value in that, or finding a maybe framework to work through some of the rails you mentioned earlier of kind of putting things on rails and starting some of these best practices early. It also just sounds like a lot of customer pull. And maybe diving into that another bit, were these customers asking you for a SOC 2, or was it just the barrage of questionnaires and requests that were like, hey, can we, rather than filling out your long spreadsheet of questions, can we get you a SOC 2? Like what did those requests look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's 2 things here that really drove us from the customer route here. There were small companies who were inundating us with their own special flavor of spreadsheet that had all the questions in it in a slightly different format, so you couldn't kind of copy paste. And at that point, every single customer becomes an hour's worth of finding questions. And we even went down the effort of like compiling a Notion database full of here are the stock questions and stock answers, and we'll copy paste. But it's kind of soul destroying work basically. And I think it is, short-term payoff, long-term, not a smart move. And so for those customers, getting to the point where we had a SOC 2 certificate that they send us their questionnaire and we go, we have something better for you. Have some of this. That's a great win for us. And then I think the other side of it is like there is a size of company, I think, where this just becomes an absolute like necessity. So, company has either a supplier operations function or a security and compliance type function, and they basically will vet the vendors and suppliers that company uses. And it's like your pass to get through the front door. And if you don't have that, you just won't get anywhere. So yeah, it was kind of an obvious win for us on both fronts.
Yeah. So playing back to you again, maybe two sorts of customers to broadly sort. One where you probably could have, or seemed like you could have continued selling to them. There was just a lot of bookkeeping and soul crushing, copying, pasting going on. And then a second set where you might not have been able to sell to. So it really was the, kind of ticket or the seat at the table to even start a sales conversation with some of the larger companies. Is that fair?
100%. Yeah, spot on.
Yeah. I was smiling as you were describing the Notion database of questions. I've talked to other founders who've done this, and they tend not to last long. I think it's one of those things that, again, does sound like it would make sense, and then it's a combination of the soul crushing work. Is it actually easier to control F on a Notion page versus another spreadsheet versus just write down the thing from memory. I've also talked to founders who tried that and then tried to outsource it. So just gave the Notion page and the questionnaire to someone who didn't work at the company, and generally found that that didn't really, that got the spreadsheet filled out, but perhaps not filled out as well as they might want for something like this.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like everyone's spreadsheet asks a slightly different question, and if you don't know what they're asking, it's really easy to pattern match on words and sort of send the complete wrong message, basically.
Yep, saw some of that. Neat. Okay, so and just maybe for the audience, you are all not through with your SOC 2 yet, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah,
we're sort of.
Yeah, so we have an auditor assigned. We are working through some of the sort of the controls and things like that at the moment. So I'd expect we're about 4 weeks away from having our type 1 certificate, and then we'll be sort of hot following that with a type 2 to sort of get both under our belt.
Oh, great. Wonderful. We might touch on this later, but curious why you went to the type 1 then type 2 route. But maybe for now, I mean, you're halfway through or going through, about 4 weeks away, don't have it yet. Given all of that and given the work you have put in, what has been the most valuable part of that? Like, what kind of have there been benefits yet, or is it more just delayed gratification?
I think having the process as a forcing function to sort of fit some good practices around what we're doing is probably what we've derived as like the most value so far. So I think it's easy just to not think about some things, and going through this and writing policies and setting things up, and even like relatively mundane things, like we hooked Vanta up to our like Heroku instance, and like very quickly we had a whole bunch of things that were green, and it was like ace, we're all good. And then there were some things where it was like, oh, we're only keeping our like application logs for 7 days, and that's like arguably like it's so cheap to store logs for longer, and it's useful to have them as like forensic evidence things, and Vanta checks that, and so that's sort of a useful thing that we've then been able to like fix basically. And there's just a lot of things along those lines, I think, that will just help us be a slightly better and more secure company.
So some amount of housekeeping, some amount of, forcing function to think through some of this early. Just one last question for you, and then we'll probably open it up to Q&A. Having gone through this process or gone halfway through it, and the end is in sight, some amount of end, do you think about security any differently?
Oh, good question. I don't think so. I think, as I said, I think we all started with like really kind of good grounded security principles. I think what we do think differently about is some of the like auditability and evidencing side of things, which sounds a little mundane, but I think it's like super important to be able to not just do things well, but demonstrate that you're doing things well. And I think like if you look at it, the ultimate person who cares about that is your customer, and they care about it through the proxy of a SOC 2. And so sometimes it feels a little bit like, thinking about auditability, evidencing, that sort of side of things feels like you're sort of doing it to sort of get your certificate, but you're not. You're doing it, I think, because it transitively leads to customers that will trust you more and see you more as a sort of like a serious company as a result of having it.
Got it. Yeah, it sounds like you all came in with this really strong base of security, and maybe adding on just how do you demonstrate that to a savvy enterprise buyer? Again, you have the practices in place, but how do you show them off beside writing in a spreadsheet that, yes, we do this. Thank you very much.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, that covers our 5 principles. I think we'll do Q&A in a moment. So please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. And I think we'll go through them, and you can post them at me, you can post them at Chris. We're both open, or Chris, I'm volunteering you, hopefully you're open. And with that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. And we did have some questions filtering in throughout, so I'll maybe throw those at you now and see what else comes in here in the next couple minutes. But one of the first questions I saw come in are, what are some examples of quick wins or things that you that are especially valuable that you could put in code?
Great. I'll start, and then Chris, would love your thoughts on this too. So in terms of things in code, so I mean, maybe first there's literally kind of infrastructure as code tools, like a Terraform or a CloudFormation or something like that, where you can put your infrastructure setup in code, which we did earlier, as I mentioned. You didn't do on day one of Vanta, but did on, I don't know, the equivalent of, day 100. And one of the ways we found that really helpful is to Chris's point about auditability and demonstration. When you do that, you just, your entire infrastructure setup is a text file. And it's a text file that someone commits, and it goes through version control, and someone else code reviews and looks at, and then it goes and gets applied, kind of gets made in the world. And just being able to look back and say, when did we create this specific piece of infrastructure? What happened to it? Was something off? Was really valuable to us. Yeah, Charlie's putting links to the tools in chat. They're great. I mean, they're quirky, but they're all learnable. So that was one of the things we did quite early. Chris, any other coding, or putting things in code examples? You mentioned version control earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's broadly. I mean, this is probably massively reductive, but there is like code as putting that in code. So obviously all your software is going to be in a repo somewhere, and that goes into GitHub or whatever else it is you're using. And then I think just like the general of the category for me is just a configuration, and Terraform is a great way of managing configuration. And that like often it gets spoken about as like managing infrastructure, but it actually does a lot more. So like Terraform can be used for everything from PagerDuty, for example, where you can either go into PagerDuty and click all of your things into existence, and that's all well and good, but it gets really hard to manage over time. Or you could Terraform it. Like there's a provider for that, and we haven't done that yet because we're 3 people and we've got one schedule and it's all good. But we've done that. I've done that at previous companies, and I think there's basically a lot of different things that you can put in there. And like the benefits of putting them all in one place as sort of like this configuration repo is that you can sort of cross-reference things, and when you want to onboard and offboard people, so it's like single line changes, and you can grep and search your code base for all these things. So yeah, I think that's broadly it for me. It's like coded configuration, but yeah, it's essentially like if there's a way we can put something in code, certainly as we grow, that is definitely the default for us.
And actually, just briefly, you mentioned also earlier using so many services that had APIs. I imagine you can do these, and you bring up the great point that it's more than just infrastructure. So PagerDuty. Anything else that you've terraformed maybe in a prior life that is worth mentioning, right, outside of strictly cloud infrastructure? Yeah,
a good question. So PagerDuty is the one that comes to mind. I've worked places where people have written their own adapters for Terraform. Mm-hmm. So it's like super extensible. Basically, if there's an API for it, you can write what's called a Terraform provider, and that sort of acts as your middle layer between the sort of Terraform application and whatever it is that you're configuring. There are like providers for most things. So if a system has an API and it has a way to configure it, that's sort of the way. Like, we're not doing it right now. It's just not worth our time at this stage, but it's certainly something that I think there's a lot of like benefit to that if you can get things in there.
Awesome. I have a question here from Derek, and I'm going to kind of tie in Dwayne's as well. Derek's asking, how long is the typical onboarding journey for a new Vanta client to get to SOC 2 status? And Dwayne was asking around the cost, if there's to get to the compliance, or if there's monthly recurring costs, and what that looks like.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll take timing first. And Chris, I'll pass this one to you first. I mean, live case study here. How long have you spent on it?
It's a good question. So I think we are what are we, maybe a couple of months, 6 weeks into our like Vantage journey. Maybe I'll just talk through like how it kind of went from zero to where it is now. So essentially, day one for us, get access to Vanta, the application, connect in a bunch of providers, essentially. So for us, that looked like Heroku, G Suite, GitHub, all of these things. And you connect into those so that Vanta can go off and pull in all of this kind of relatively boring evidence that, auditors want to be able to see. So things like, if you're storing data, is it encrypted at rest? That's the kind of thing that in past lives I've had to go to consoles, screenshot, send them a thing. And it's like, every time you have an audit, you'll do that. And Vanta will kind of solve some of that. So that was like super quick for us, like talking hours to get everything set up. And that sort of gives you your sort of like lay of the land from day one. At that point, we basically press pause on a bunch of things because we had a bunch of other stuff going on for the company. But then the sort of the next big thing for us to tackle is policies. So we went through, I spent basically a week, and Vanta provides a bunch of like template policies that you can draw on. And then from there, you sort of customize them to however your company works. There's a bunch of things we removed, a bunch of language we changed and stuff. And that was basically me for a week in the evenings alongside another job. So not a huge investment of time. And then at that point, it was a case of like, go and find an auditor. So Vanta referred 3 different auditors based on some requirements that we had for things that we were interested in. I spent a bit of time talking to them, sort of understanding how they wanted to work, etc. Chose one of them. And then sort of from that point, that's sort of relatively close to where we are today. So we've done our sort of onboarding with them, and we've spoken about timescales and sort of the list of things that need to get done between now and being certified. I think like, I guess to sort of like boil all of that down, if I was doing this and it was my sole focus, I think I could have got to where we are today in 2 weeks. And then I think from that point, relatively aggressive, but probably not unreasonable timeline is sort of 4 weeks to get a type 1, which is, for anyone who's not aware, like a kind of point in time SOC 2 thing, which sort of says, yes, we've assessed you at this point, and it's sort of not quite as good as a type 2, and some people won't be super happy with it. But a type 2 is that, but like over a longer period kind of thing.
That's a great explanation. Yeah. And just to thank you for that overview, and for what it's worth, when we see companies go through Vanta, I think actually, Chris, your timeline is both quite accurate and representative in a few ways. One, just literally the 6 weeks or 2 weeks piece, like the actual numbers you gave. And 2, this idea that, and we do have some customers sit down and joke about it, but sort of blitz out everything and do it in 2 weeks, or do everything in a week and a half. And it is sort of their sole focus, but they can get things done quite quickly. And that's for the minority of customers, but certainly exists, especially when it's kind of the 3 founders sort of stage of a company. And then there's folks, and it's probably the majority, who say, this is great, but I'm also a startup founder or an early startup employee, and I have 90 other tasks to do on any given day. And so I'm going to, do some of this every day, perhaps half hours, and get it done over a longer period of time, but also keep a few other balls in the air.
Excellent. And could you speak to the cost a little bit of what that looks like?
Yeah,
to get
absolutely.
Compliant?
For sure. So there's 2 big pieces of the cost. If you go with Vanta, one is the software fee. It is just a subscription to the software itself. That starts in kind of around like low 5 figures, basically. Vanta, we price based on company headcount. So I'll ask you how many people at your company and kind of price based on that, but low 5 figures. Then there's a second piece of the cost, which I sort of alluded to, but is working with an auditor. So it's a separate audit fee paid directly to an auditor, not to someone like Vanta. That's roughly the same as the software fee. Often it can be a little bit lower. So all in, you're looking at probably $25,000. Say if you're a small company, it's just a rough budget for this. And then, sometimes one of the questions I get is, oh, great, is this a one and done thing? Thank you so much. And the answer is unfortunately no. So a SOC 2 report, the kind of PDF that unlocks these, new markets that Chris was talking about, has a date on it, right? And the date says, yeah, this report is good as of, July 21st, 2021. And so you'll often end up they're good for a year. So July 21st, 2021 through, July 21st, 2022. And while no one, it's not like the PDF disintegrates or anything on you, but to Chris's point about these reports sort of being ways to demonstrate your security and your maturity as an organization. Often folks don't like to send around old ones. So it tends to be an annually recurring audit, something that roughly happens every year.
Excellent. There's a question here as well, referencing the tracking people as well as things piece, around asking if you could elaborate a little bit on ways that you're reducing pain, but ensuring the right level of security controls are in place.
Oh, yes. And is this, go for it.
No, go ahead, Christina.
No, go for it.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I think this was in reference to me, saying if people find things painful, they will find workarounds. And like cards on the table, like we have no employees yet. So it's very easy for me to say that. Basically what I mean by this is essentially I want to have a very clear process in place that is, if things feel like they're introducing too much friction, I just want people to just shout about it. I want that to be in as one of the most important cultural pieces, in the same way you want people whistleblowing if they see, really horrible things happening at your company, right? I want the same thing for security. I want people to just not assume that things have to be the way they are. Usually there are better ways for doing things. And if there's not, at least it's an opportunity to kind of explain why and lay some additional context there.
That's great. And just from a Vanta company perspective, we try to do the same thing. And I think, given what we do, we probably have a little bit more leeway to ask employees for things, but this is not a card we want to put on the table at all. And think about it as, what are the practices we have for an organization? What are useful? And then what sort of best practices can we try to codify in our own code of the product that are distributed out to other startups to help them.
That's great. And there's another question here around best practices. In order to reduce the threat of ransomware vulnerabilities at medium or large companies.
Oh, what best practices there?
Are there different ones that SMEs or just medium and large companies can put in place to help reduce?
Anything you've seen in your prior lives, Chris?
I mean, there are lots of things, and it depends on the size of your company. I don't have a particularly polished or refined answer right now on this one. I think this is where we will lean on probably some external security people as well. So I'd hope that through pen tests and engage, we have a security company that we talk to about this kind of thing. It's the kind of thing I would almost certainly just seek advice on.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, pen tests, and especially, some amount of infrastructure security for your application. This is also a place where we've seen some of the cloud infrastructure checking be helpful. And again, this is just to Chris's point, one of many ways you could be subject to a ransomware attack. So don't mean to say it's comprehensive, but just something that kind of roughly checks, are all the databases, closed to outsiders or queues or anything like that. Just making sure that in the scheme of setting up cloud infrastructure, which can be quite complicated, whether you're clicking buttons or putting it in code, that no one kind of inadvertently left the equivalent of the side door open to the house.
Yeah, I think one other thing actually I've seen that's worked pretty well, and we've done this a few times before, is game day sort of for these kinds of things. So
capture the flags.
Yeah, I mean, test your response to these things. Assume that something's gone wrong. What would you do? And it often is quite helpful to kind of figure out where you're exposed. So, are your backups stored in the same place as your database? And if someone was, to jump in and encrypt one, could they delete the other? And that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a sort of, I guess, a general catch-all that's quite useful for different scenarios.
Yeah, and I think also speaks to your point about building a culture of security early on, of just how do you do this early? How do you do it in a way that doesn't feel like forcing everyone to eat broccoli? All of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one last question here. Who issues the SOC 1 and SOC 2 statuses, and are there any extra fees associated with that?
Yes, we've spoken about auditors. So the organization that can, or kind of defines the SOC 2 standard is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, AICPA. And so it's the American Association of CPAs, basically. And so you can work with a CPA firm as your auditor. And so when Chris was talking about going and talking to auditors, that Vanta introduced him to, those were conversations with CPA firms based in the US.
Awesome. There's actually one more question, if you guys have time, that just came in. Around does a third party monitor Vanta? The reason that they're asking is Vanta will be given access to infrastructure to run various checks. In the example, data is encrypted at rest. How does Vanta guarantee that their servers will not be compromised?
Great question. So a few answers beside the obvious, we have our own SOC 2. I think more philosophically, right? Like we see this, Vanta being compromised as a company ending event, quite likely. And so take it as seriously as that would imply. So beside, running Vanta and Vanta, engaging pen testers and security researchers, staying abreast of best practices. Security is very much a focus of our engineering team and has been since the early days. So quite a few, and we have some other things I kind of won't mention on a recorded webinar, but quite a few things, and taken with the, I think, seriousness and severity that it deserves.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that concludes here the Q&A. I know if you wanted to speak here to the offer really quick, and we'll close down.
Yeah, just thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate the hour out of your day. Thank you. We have a $1,000 off offer on Vanta. If you go to info.com or info.vanta.com/launch, that will kind of tag you as having this code. And we'd love to talk to you now, in the future, whenever it is, when you're thinking about both shoring up your company's security and then demonstrating it with a compliance certification.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. Thanks for everyone for jumping on the jam session. We'll continue the conversation, like I said before, and this week in startups.com/Slack. You can also reach out to Christina or Chris as well. Is there any, the last kind of thing I'll leave, is there any special way outside of email, or is that talking to you directly? Is that the best way to get in contact with either one of you, or do you have some other form?
For me, email works. Yep.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll conclude here the jam session on security. I appreciate your time, and thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks so much for having us.